talking about smuggling and the legal trade along the Texas border. So throughout the 19th century, Texas maintained a position of importance domestically and in international diplomacy. The precise reasons for this changed a lot over time, although the geographic position of Texas was a persistent factor, right? Texas has the second longest international border in the United States, surpassed only by Alaska, which of course was not part of the United States for much of the time period we're going to be talking about. This lengthy land border and lengthy sea border created both problems and opportunities for Texans. And so it's no surprise that trade along the Texas border was a constant concern for both business interests and political interests, and oftentimes the same people, right? So what I want to do today is just run through some of the examples of illegal trade in Texas, and I hope to show that smuggling was tolerated by Texans and later by Americans as an economic booster, despite the damage it did to national sovereignty. Smuggling and illegal trade presents historians with an interesting problem and is a powerful tool for exploring the 19th century. After all, for trade to be illegal, there have to be laws against it. By its very nature, smuggling weakens the political authority of a state. You're breaking a law by smuggling, right? And these traders that we're going to be talking about were defying the law of the land. No taxes got paid, no tariffs could be enforced. There was no way to keep track of what goods and people were coming in and out of your country. This is problematic if you're going to be a government, and embarrassing for a government to be unable to keep track of what's going on in their borders. What I would like to suggest is that it was not that the government could not deal with illegal trade. It was more that it chose not to. Smuggling in Texas came in a series of waves that boosted the economic power of the state. But when smuggling became too rampant, as did happen 2 or 3 times, then the government had to step in, reel it back, and sort of say, enough is enough. We can't allow this nonsense. Complete disregard for the law was unacceptable to the nation as a whole, even if the nation benefited. And we'll see this several times in this lecture, at least I hope we will. And I don't just mean the United States either. When I talk about Texas, we are, of course, going to be talking about Texas as an independent republic and Texas as a part of the nation state of Mexico, each at various points. So, with that idea in the back of our heads, let's jump right in. One of the persistent features of Texas in the 19th century is that Texas was a frontier state. When we think about the Texas frontier, we conjure up images of a place that tested and emboldened men, a masculine area where the rules did not apply. You know, the essence of the frontier was to defy authority and the mandates that that authority attempted to impose. When as flawed as this image is, historically speaking, it still holds some background, and it's not surprising that the type of people attracted to Texas in the early years of the 1800s were not the type of people who were particularly inclined to obey the rules. Attracted by cheap land and fresh opportunities, a steady flow of Anglo-Americans began to travel to the Mexican state shortly after Mexico's independence from Spain. Stephen F. Austin famously brought 300 families into Texas, followed by an additional 900 families later in the 1820s. Most of these new Texas immigrants came from the American South and had no qualms about forcing enslaved Africans and African Americans to journey to this new frontier. There was, in fact, a massive market, not just in Texas, but in Louisiana, Arkansas, the Gulf states in general, a massive market for enslaved people. In the 1808, the United States banned the international slave trade, and in its place, a thriving domestic slave trade developed, one that moved by both land and by sea. These slave couples of enslaved people chained together moving by road were common, but just as common were ships who had enslaved people in their holds, much as the Atlantic slave trade had done before. The domestic slave trade helped spur westward expansion as cotton agriculture demanded the cheap labor that enslaved workers provided, and the demand for enslaved laborers was always higher than the supply. So here we get to the topic of the day, illegal trade and smuggling. Along the edges of the domestic slave trade, which was legal, lurked a host of illegal slave traders who helped fill the demand for enslaved workers. And so, from the very beginning of Anglo-American involvement in Texas, illegal trade was a central feature of the Texas economy. The men in Texas who trafficked in enslaved humans were some of the wealthiest and most famous people in Texas history. These are not sort of just criminals and thugs. These are prominent members of society. And that is going to be a feature that remains true throughout 19th century history, that the people involved in this illegal trade are not just sort of lurkers on the edge of things. They are essential to the economic and political life of the state. The most infamous slave traffickers in the early part of Texas history were the famous Lafitte brothers, the now very, very well-known pirates who controlled almost all of the illegal trade along the Gulf Coast in the 18 teens and the early 1820s. The Lafitte's operated out of their blacksmith shop in New Orleans, where they were regarded as war heroes for their actions during the War of 1812, in concert with famous Texans such as Jim Bowie, who would go on to fight at the Alamo. The Lafitte brothers and others filled a critical market on both sides of the border between the United States and Mexico by illegally importing enslaved Africans. These enslaved Africans came not only from the Caribbean, but also from Africa. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. The process of illegally importing slaves into Texas and from there into the United States was not terribly complex. The Lafitte brothers had ships. They captured slave ships. Now, the Spanish Empire was still engaged in the international slave trade. So the Lafitte brothers would capture Spanish ships. They financed their own trips to the African coast. They purchased slaves in nearby islands like Cuba, and then transported these enslaved peoples aboard ships to the Texas coast. From there, they either sold the enslaved people directly to Texas settlers, or they handed them off to other slave traffickers like the Bowie brothers, like Jim Bowie. The Bowies had their own method for importing these enslaved laborers into the United States, and in fact, a pretty foolproof method. They would move the enslaved people shortly towards the marshal's buildings, the law. The enslaved people were brought to in close proximity with the law, and then the Bowie brothers reported them. They reported the enslaved people that they themselves were smuggling to the authorities who were supposed to enforce the anti-slave trade laws in place. As confiscated goods, the authorities would place the enslaved Africans onto an auction, onto a market, sell them off to the highest bidder. The proceeds from that would be split between the government and the person who informed the government of the slaves' location, the Bowies, who had brought the slaves into Louisiana or Texas in the first place. Naturally, the Bowie brothers were their own informants, so they received the money that they got, that they paid for the auction as they bought the slaves back at marked down prices. There were plenty of other ways to smuggle slaves into Texas, some even more simple and less complicated than the Bowie brothers. Many people who came to Texas brought slaves against Mexican law, claimed those enslaved people as members of their families or as indentured servants. There were often papers that were filled out stating that the enslaved people had been freed, quote unquote, but had agreed to an indenturement for the rest of their lives. This is not a particularly subtle way of going about the business. Thrilling midnight drop-offs and forced marches along the coast rarely ever occurred. Forged papers were easy to obtain. Sometimes the same papers would just be used over and over and over for dozens, if not hundreds, of enslaved people. Revenue inspectors, customs officials, sheriffs, later Texas Rangers, were easy to fool or to bribe, and that is assuming that the official authorities were not involved in the trade themselves. Quite a few of the people supposed to enforce the laws regularly broke it. And in fact, there were even claims made against Andrew Jackson himself that he was involved in the illegal slave trade made during the War of 1812. In fact, a little before in 1810. The market for enslaved Africans in Texas was so profitable that Jean and Pierre Lafitte ended up moving to Texas. Jean Lafitte built his own pirate city on Galveston Island, and Galveston would go on to remain one of the most important smuggling ports along the Gulf Coast throughout the 19th century. Lafitte's pirates and smugglers dominated illegal trade along the Gulf Coast for several years. Their pirate fleets not only captured enslaved ships, they made their own slave voyages to the coast of Africa. More than 2,000 inhabitants called Lafitte's pirate refuge on Galveston home. Although it is nearly impossible to know exactly how many enslaved Africans were smuggled through Galveston Island, a single ship that landed in Galveston in 1817 contained upward of 400 enslaved Africans. Now, since the purchasing cost of an enslaved African worker, one worker, was roughly equivalent to a year's salary for your average wage laborer, when we consider that it was very easy for a single ship to transport 200, 300, 400 enslaved people, the scale of profit of slave smuggling along the Texas coast is not hard to see. The Lafitte brothers and their compatriots, the Texas settlers that they sold to, became fabulously wealthy, and by 1820, Jean Lafitte's endeavors had attracted official attention from the United States. The United States sent ships to Galveston Island and negotiated a peaceful treaty with Jean. In exchange for being allowed to leave peacefully, Jean would give up his base on Galveston. He burned down the city. He agreed to leave with all of his wealth and ships intact. This was hardly a stern enforcement of American laws regarding the international slave trade. Several of the people that Jean Lafitte left behind were enslaved, and several of them claimed to have been brought to Galveston, either from the Caribbean or from Africa itself. But the U.S. military was just not concerned about it after the fact. The end of the Lafitte crime empire was not the end of slave smuggling, and in fact is what ended up happening throughout the 1820s and the 1830s was that slave smuggling into Texas became even more prevalent, if less centralized. The absence of the Lafitte crime empire allowed other slave smugglers to sort of move in on their territory. An atomization of illegal trade occurred along the Texas coast, and a whole slew of traffickers just openly defied American and Mexican laws. The reach of the illegal slave trade in Texas went all the way to the top. And that is something that I would like for y'all to understand. This was not, like I said, this was not just small individuals. This was an organized and very powerful series of traders in Texas. The illegal slave trade was not simply conducted by pirates and smugglers, but was recognized and utilized by the most influential men in the state. The father of Texas, Stephen F. Austin, had been born into a slaveholding family and ensured that slavery persisted in Anglo-American Texas. Although Austin himself was famously ambivalent towards slavery as an institution, he recognized the economic benefits of slavery and the slave trade and was unwilling or unable to deny Texans access to enslaved laborers. While there is no clear evidence that Austin himself was connected with slave smuggling, and I do want to be clear about that, Austin may or may not have known, we don't know, but one of Austin's closest allies and friends, Samuel May Williams, interacted with slave traffickers regularly and used his position in the old 300 colony to great personal profit. In the 1830s, in the run-up to the Texas Revolution, Williams' position as a revenue collector for the nation of Mexico served as protection for slave smugglers. Williams was supposed to enforce Mexican laws that opposed the international slave trade. Instead, Williams used those to facilitate the illegal slave trade. His 11 leagues of land along key waterways, especially along the Brazos River, served as a haven for illegal traders throughout the 1820s and 1830s. The slave trade into Texas was so effective that by 1830, fully 25% of people living in Texas were enslaved. And as late as 1870, after the American Civil War and after emancipation, Texas still had more native-born Africans than any other state in the Union, except Georgia and Louisiana, highlighting the continued presence of slave smuggling throughout the antebellum period. One of the reasons that illegal trade was so persistent in Texas history was simply the sheer difficulty of stopping. The challenge to national sovereignty that slave smuggling represented became too much for either Mexico or the United States to tolerate. For instance, the United States put forward $100,000 to stop smuggling after 1820, slave smuggling in particular, though this was nowhere near sufficient to actually put an end to the trade. In 1823, President James Monroe delivered the message that enunciated the famous Monroe Doctrine. Among other things, the Monroe Doctrine placed the onus for stopping the illegal slave trade squarely on the federal government. Monroe said that it was the U.S. government's job to enforce their ban of the international slave trade. For its part, Mexico began a gradual abolition of slavery, although Texas received numerous exceptions to some degree or another because cotton agriculture was so profitable. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire began to actively pursue slave traders in its own attempts to extinguish the Atlantic slave trade. After 1830 or so, the national and international powers of the time were less and less willing to tolerate the existence of illegal slave trafficking in Texas in particular and the Atlantic Ocean in general. But the story of illegal slave smuggling is not quite over yet. These actions on the part of the United States and the part of Mexico and the part of Great Britain were a distinct threat to slave smugglers, and it pushed slave smugglers and, of course, the enslavers who bought from slave smugglers towards drastic action. Recent research, including some of my own research, suggests that slave smugglers played an important, if not necessarily fundamental role in the drive for Texas independence, as the Mexican government began to crack down on slavery in the state. For a variety of reasons, Texans moved to declare independence in 1836 and kicked off the Texas Revolution. Much like early Texas settlement, illegal trade in general and slave smuggling in particular was a key issue at the time. Although the independence conventions across Texas made no explicit mention of slave trafficking, slave smugglers knew which side of the bread was buttered. Monroe Edwards was a slave smuggler along the Sabine and San Bernard rivers. He actually put his money where his mouth was, as it were. He contributed the profits from his prime ring, which purchased slaves from Cuba and imported them into Texas illegally. He sent the profits that he made from these illegal voyages and donated them to the cause of Texas independence. Nor was Monroe Edwards the only Texas revolutionary involved in slave smuggling. What small navy that the Texas revolutionists had was donated in no small part by slave smugglers. Several ships, for instance, were donated by James Morgan, who owned a massive shipping empire, and Morgan himself was a smuggler in slaves. Not so coincidentally, James Morgan had been a representative at the Convention of 1832, one of the preludes to the Texas Revolution. James Morgan would go on to have an important role in the government of the Texas Republic. And so these slave traffickers were very much in favor of Texas independence from the nation of Mexico, and they were contributing to their own self-interest. And therefore, it is supremely ironic that the successful independence of Texas, the successful revolution in Texas, struck a death blow to slave smuggling, although it took some time. Immediately after they achieved independence, Texans took steps to enshrine the institution of slavery in their government and in their society. And it was this legal status that led to the downfall of smuggling, since, after all, if you could trade in them legally, there was no need to smuggle. The Texas government passed laws allowing slave traders to trade with the United States. And unfortunately for those enslaved traders, the United States did not have any such reciprocal law. So it was legal for Texas slave traders to trade with the United States, but not with the United States to trade with Texas. Smuggling would persist into Texas, but no longer out of Texas. The success of the Texas Revolution had another effect that I'd like to mention with y'all. An aspect of slave trafficking that I'd want to note. The border between Texas and Mexico, the rather fuzzy border between Texas and Mexico, stopped becoming a haven for illegal slave trading and became a haven for illegal slave escapees. For decades following Texas independence, enslaved Texans repeatedly ran away from plantations in the Republic and later in the state towards the Mexican border and personal freedom. Entire maroon towns and communities formed along the Texas border, populated by runaway slaves, especially along the Brazos River and further south along the Rio Grande River. These towns persisted for years at a time. Formerly enslaved people along the border engaged in their own illegal trade. Smuggling was not just a top-down thing. You can't really control smugglers. So while many of the smugglers were the movers and shakers of Texas, there were naturally plenty of smugglers who were a thorn in the side of Texas government and the economics of the nation state of Texas. Maroons, as they were called, former slaves who had run away, teamed up with Mexicans and with Native Americans, especially Seminoles. They engaged in cattle rustling and raiding, liberation of other enslaved people. These were all common activities designed to strike back at encroaching Texans along the border, as well as, of course, make a living. If you were an escaped slave, you still needed to eat, right? The Mexican government tolerated and even welcomed this alliance, believing that it stopped Americans from further encroaching on the border with Mexico. And so if smuggling had been tolerated in the period before we're talking about, in the 1820s and 30s, when it was profitable for the rich and famous and powerful of Texas, when smuggling was a detriment to them, then they took steps to stop it. The Mexican government was mistaken in thinking that Texas and the United States was just going to allow this sort of thorn in the side of Texas slaveholders and Texas ranchers. Remember at the beginning, I said that the US government usually chose not to deal with smuggling. Well, this was one of the times when it chose to deal with smuggling. In the 1840s, Texas Rangers and the US military clashed repeatedly with Seminoles and runaway slaves along the Rio Grande, ratcheting up tensions between the US and Mexico. These tensions, the presence of Maroon communities along the ill-defined Texas-Mexico border, pushed President James K. Polk to send Zachary Taylor to Texas. The Nueces River had been mostly accepted as the border, but the presence of runaway communities along the Rio Grande was one of several reasons for Polk and the United States to expand their territory and kick off the Mexican-American War. After the Mexican-American War, smuggling and illegal trade slowed down in Texas a lot. The most valuable product to smuggle, i.e. enslaved laborers, was less of an issue, as Texas, which had now been brought into the United States, Texas was now protected under the banner of the domestic slave trade rather than the illegal international slave trade. Other profitable goods were not yet as important sources of wealth as enslaved laborers had been, and smugglers were less likely to take a lot of those risks for less profits. That being said, there were still plenty of opportunities to make an illegal fortune in Texas. You've probably heard the saying, if you can't beat them, join them. These smugglers had been operating along the border of Texas and Mexico for several decades. Mexico decided, if you can't beat them, join them, that was the way to go. They created the Zona Libre, a stretch of land along the border where merchants could trade with relative freedom, regardless of other tariffs and laws put into place. In 1858, this duty-free zone, if you want to think of it that way, the Zona Libre, was created in an attempt to reinvigorate settlements in North Texas. And I'm going to share this map real fast if I can. There we go. I hope you can see that. At first, the Zona Libre extended up to Villa Guerrero, as you can see, but eventually in 1884 it was extended all the way into Arizona and Nogales. This Zona Libre was a prime site for smugglers to bring goods from Europe and from the United States into Mexico with no risk. This was, in fact, an attempt on the part of the Mexican government to control smuggling for its own benefit. Now, technically, only goods that stayed in the Zona Libre were exempt from taxes and tariffs, i.e. anything that left the zone was supposed to then be taxed. But of course, this law was difficult to enforce. Texans moved quickly across the border to try and take advantage of the Zona, and many Texans immediately decried the Zona Libre as an attempt to create ghost towns and make money at the expense of Texas traders. But by 1858, the United States had other problems to deal with. The Zona Libre remained an afterthought for the United States and the Mexican government. It did persist, and like I said, or as you may have seen, it persisted until 1905. But of course, right after the creation of the Zona Libre in 1860, the United States suddenly found that it had much bigger problems to deal with than some smuggling to Mexico, i.e. the Civil War. The recently created Zona Libre was going to have to wait. But secession and the Civil War marked a new wave of illicit trade and a new generation of Texas-based smugglers. The old guard had been engaged in slave smuggling and in slave trafficking in the 1820s and 30s were mostly, gone. A new generation of illegal traffickers or illegal traders was going to take the fore during the Civil War. The Confederacy, of course, was perennially short of war materials and the money to buy war materials. For its part, the Union, in one of its three prongs designed to end the Civil War, swiftly instituted a winding Union blockade along the Gulf Coast and along the entire Southern Coast, and consequently blockade runners, utilizing swift steam engines rather than slow sailing ships. Blockade runners became an important lifeline for the Confederacy. Now, Texas was not an ideal destination for blockade running. There were still not very many people in Texas. Texas sat on the very western edges of the conflict. It just wasn't the best place for blockade runners to land. But the early capture of New Orleans meant that there were only a few options along the Gulf Coast for smugglers to land. Galveston, then a modest city of some 8,000 inhabitants, took on a new level of importance. And during the Civil War, the Union Navy was just as aware of this as the Confederates were. The federal blockade of Galveston began quickly on July 2nd, 1861. But once again, the long meandering Texas coastline proved nearly impossible to monitor. And quite a few Americans were willing to put profit before partisanship, if I can use that phrase, especially when it came to the Civil War and shipping. Not just in the South either. One of the most important, or not just in Texas either, one of the most important steamship builders and shipping magnates in the nation, Charles Morgan, no relation to James Morgan in the Texas Revolution. Charles Morgan, who owned a slew of steamships that ran along the Gulf Coast and up to New York and Cuba and Veracruz and a few other destinations, Morgan was happy to play both sides against the other. The Morgan steamship lines had regularly traveled along the Gulf Coast, so Charles Morgan was in a prime position to take advantage of the Civil War. Morgan's son-in-law, a virulent Confederate, quickly transformed the fleet into a fleet of blockade runners for the Confederate cause, sending them to Cuba and to Great Britain and to other Caribbean islands for war materials, bringing cotton out of the Confederacy, guns, medicine, etc., into the Confederacy. While Morgan Jr., as it were, was busy working for the Confederacy, Charles Morgan, Morgan Sr., was quite happily building steamships for the Union Navy, designed to stop the very blockade runners that he was invested in. And so it's not hard to see how smugglers and shipping magnates were playing both sides to their advantage. Here in Texas, Confederate supporters began investing in their own blockade running, just like the rest of the South. A group of wealthy Texans, headed by prominent Galveston merchant Nelson Clements, banded together to invest $50,000 into a Texas-based blockade runner. On June 5th, 1862, the steamer General Rusk broke past the Galveston blockade with a cargo of Texas-grown cotton bound for Havana. 2 months later, the Rusk returned to the Texas coast, now under a different name and sailing a British flag, with a hold full of ammunition and war materials, landing at Indianola, before once again setting out with a cargo of cotton for the Caribbean. After one more successful voyage, the Union military ran the General Rusk aground. And ironically, at this point, the Rusk was wearing a Spanish flag, and the Union government was forced to pay a hefty indemnity to not only the Spanish government, but eventually to the very Confederate investors that they were trying to defeat in the Civil War. The complications, I think, are pretty easy to see. In some cases, the Confederate government bankrolled the blockade runners, but in others, it was this mix of private investors like Clements who were just trying to make a profit off of the conflict. It was a real mixed bag. Blockade running was a pretty risky investment to go, or a pretty risky thing to do, but the investments were fairly solid. It didn't take many successful voyages for Confederate investors to make a profit on blockade runners. Even if the ship sank after the second or third voyage, it only took 1 or 2 voyages to ensure that investors got their money back. And in the midst of this milieu of illegal trade and smuggling and blockade running, illegal trade with Mexico picked back up. There had been a lull after the Mexican-American War, but now in the context of the Civil War, Mexico and trade with Mexico took on a lot more importance. Specifically, Matamoros and Brownsville. The city of Matamoros and Brownsville, let me show you the map again real fast just so we can highlight where those cities are. Pop, there we go. Matamoros and Brownsville, right at the edge of Texas, right here where the Texas and Mexico border meets. Matamoros and Brownsville became the centers of Confederate smuggling into and out of Texas during the American Civil War. Of course, the Mexican government was not necessarily thrilled at being drawn into the American Civil War, but the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo stated that the Rio Grande River was to be left completely open for both nations, or any nation. And so there was little the Mexican government could do about it. It was sort of hampered by these previous treaty, and the United States government was hampered by this previous treaty. The trade in Matamoros might have stopped quickly. The Mexican government might have done something to put a stop to it. But in 1861, a coalition of European powers invaded Mexico and embroiled Mexico in its own protracted war. While the United States was trying to deal with the Civil War, Mexico was trying to deal with the French intervention in Mexico. This opened up Matamoros even more for Confederate smugglers looking to help the war effort and make a profit. Local officials estimated that as much as 80% of the international trade to Matamoros was designed to aid the Confederate endeavor. A U.S. consul in Matamoros described the city as, quote, the great thoroughfare into the southern states. And in fact, in 1862, in just a few short years, Matamoros had grown to be one of the largest port cities in the world, although it would shrink as soon as the Civil War was over. The same Nelson Clement, who had funded the General Rusk, once again invested in illegal trade. Clement purchased 20,000 rifles, 5,000 pistols, 5,000 sabers on behalf of the Confederate States and smuggled them into Matamoros, bound for Brownsville. Despite the best efforts of Confederate Texans to support the war effort and their own pocketbooks, blockade running in Texas remained something of an afterthought until the second half of the Civil War, as more and more eastern port cities fell to the Union cause. Galveston became one of the last open Confederate ports in 1864 after the fall of Wilmington and Charleston, and Texas remained invested in the idea of smuggling goods from Mexico into Texas and into the Confederacy, even if it was a long and lengthy and perilous voyage. A few Texans in particular found a way to turn a serious profit out of the American Civil War. And these are a few guys that we actually would probably know, and if we don't, we maybe should know. Businessman and banker Charles Stillman, the founder of Brownsville, built a mercantile fortune by smuggling cotton out of Texas and war materials into it. Stillman was already pretty wealthy before the Civil War. He ran in the highest of social circles. He was friends and business partners with Richard King of the famous King Ranch and Mifflin Kennedy of the famous Kennedy Ranch. Stillman even married two of his daughters into the Rockefeller family. So this guy is hooked up. Stillman, King, and Kennedy dominated trade and finance in the Rio Grande Valley before, during, and after the American Civil War. And in fact, Stillman and King were old hands at the game of illegal trade. Stillman had supplied Zachary Taylor's army during the Mexican-American War, moving war materials upriver on his rafts. Stillman and King and Kennedy were all involved in the Mexican-American War, funding the army. Stillman and King moved into illegal trade shortly after, in the 1850s, by supplying the private army of General Jose Carbajal during the short-lived Merchants' War. Carvajal's Merchants' War was a failure, but Stillman and King made a nice fat profit out of this private war and attempt to take over northern Mexico. So Stillman and King were already aware of how to go about the process of illegal trade once the Civil War got started. And during the Civil War, Stillman, King, and Kennedy took shrewd advantage of the war and their proximity with Mexico. The three business magnates gathered up cotton from all across Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, moving the cotton along riverboats, by wagons, and even in two-wheeled carts to get it down to Brownsville, Matamoros, and the border with Mexico. They sold the cotton in Mexico in exchange for medicine, textiles, uniforms, military supplies, which the Confederacy was in desperate need of, and then shipped those goods back into the Confederacy. The scheme was enormously profitable for the three Texans. They netted an average of $60,000 each per month for 3 years, from 1862 to 1864. This was a bonanza of profit for Stillman, King, and Kennedy. And in a supremely ironic turn of events, by the way, the cotton that they sold in Mexico, was actually purchased by the U.S. War Department, the Union. Their Confederate cotton was mostly shipped into the northern states, where it was woven into Union uniforms. Their ability to play the Union and the Confederacy against each other not only earned the three men an enormous fortune, in fact, 3 enormous fortunes, it allowed them to keep their fortunes after the war, as the Union government, the federal government, dropped treason charges against both King and Stillman. They knew they had been involved in this smuggling, but they were willing to set it aside because the cotton had ultimately been sold to the Union itself. Whether or not the Stillman knew specifically that the Union was buying cotton is a little unclear, but his agent in Matamoros was definitely aware of who he was selling the cotton to. The story of Charles Stillman and Richard King does not end with the Civil War, however. We're not quite done yet. The two men remained invested in illegal weapons shipments in the decades that followed, providing Stillman and King with comfortable lifestyles and profitable business deals during the hard years of Reconstruction. In 1865, with the Civil War in the United States coming to an end, the United States was suddenly able to turn around and notice that Mexico had been involved in an ongoing war with France since 1861. This was unacceptable to the government of the United States. The United States government did not want a reinvigorated French empire on its southern border. And so the United States began to connive ways to help the Mexicans fight off the French military and the French-born Emperor Maximilian. But the official power of the United States military was pretty exhausted by 4 years of civil war. Some of the best that the United States could do was provide supplies to the Mexicans fighting this war, and they turned to Stillman and Kennedy, since they were already plugged into an established network of illicit trade. After the Civil War, the smuggling networks and the illegal trade that we've been talking about, the direction of trade sort of turned around. Rather than sending goods and military weapons, war materials into Texas and into the United States began to provide weapons and war materials outside of the United States. Stillman and Kennedy began running guns, basically, into Mexico to help the liberal government there overthrow the French-born Emperor Maximilian. And it was really successful. In just a few short years, Mexican liberals did overthrow the French military with the help of American firearms. They executed Maximilian, and Mexico was once again an independent nation, in no small part because of these weapons that had been smuggled into Mexico. For the rest of his life, Stillman remained invested in gun running and into Mexico. His death in 1875 did nothing to slow his illegal business. Matamoros still held 500 rifles, 250,000 rounds of ammunition, and 2 million recharging cartridges in Stillman's warehouses in 1877. American financiers, and Texans in particular, contributed more than $500,000 to Porfirio Diaz's rebellion, another wave of violence and warfare waged with smuggled weapons out of the United States. The supplies sent by Stillman and his cohort contributed to Porfirio Diaz's capture of Matamoros, his victory over the Mexican government, and his successive 30-year reign after that. Illegal trade into Mexico after the Civil War was widespread, profitable, and nearly impossible to extinguish. And it had occurred with the tacit approval of some of the highest levels of American government, up to and including the Secretary of State, Wilson Fisk. Congress attempted to put a stop to the gun running across the border and forced Fisk to step in. They sent the United States military to the border to enforce American laws and enforce American trade deals. laws and trade deals that local Texans were flagrantly ignoring. Unfortunately for Congress, the general that they sent to enforce the laws and to keep Texans from involving themselves in illegal trade ignored them. General Edward Ord, who was down in Texas on the border to enforce the laws, was actually a drinking buddy of Richard King, who was involved in the smuggling of these goods. Ord flat refused to follow the orders from his superiors, siding with wealthy Texans and Porfirio Diaz rather than the United States government. But after a while, everybody has a breaking point. Because of the decades of smuggling and illegal trade that had persisted along the lengthy Mexican-American border since the 1820s, in the 1870s, the United States and Mexico decided that it was really time to do something serious about it. With the relative stability after Reconstruction and after Diaz's Porfiriato, neither sovereign nation could tolerate the unapologetic disregard that smugglers and traders paid to their own laws. While politicians in both the United States and Mexico claimed that the Zona Libre, which was now entering its second or third decade, facilitated smuggling, the reality was that the Zona Libre was pretty successful in legitimizing trade. While small-scale smuggling persisted, it never did reach the levels that illegal smuggling had enjoyed in the 1860s and 70s. And 1877 was a banner year for ending smuggling along the Texas border. In 1877, Diaz came to power in Mexico. In the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes became president in one of the most contentious and some would argue corrupt elections in U.S. history. Both men wanted to secure the border as a means of securing their own control over their countries. The lax border and decades of smuggling had created a host of other problems, up to and including corrupt officials, cattle rustling, banditry, kidnapping, Native American raids on both sides of the border, lynch mobs, a whole host of general chaos and violence had ensued along the Rio Grande. Diaz and Hayes dispatched troops to vigorously enforce the border and each nation's respective laws. Corrupt government and military officials, such as General Ord, were arrested or otherwise removed from the situation. On a related note, after leaving the military, in no small part due to his arrest, Ord used the move to his advantage. After Diaz became president, his daughter married a prominent Mexican general. Ord himself got a new job working for former president and commander Ulysses S. Grant on the short-lived Mexican Railroad, and generally enjoyed a pretty good life in Mexico for the rest of his life. After 1877, smuggling declined for the rest of the 19th century. Both the United States and Mexico entered into a period of relative stability that kind of precluded the need for illegal trade across the border. Furthermore, both nations began to assert more control over their borders and over their national sovereignty, and were no longer willing to turn such a blind eye to illegal trade. The arms smugglers who had made such fabulous fortunes in Texas and along the Texas-Mexico border began to look elsewhere for ways to make a profit, most notably the slew of banana republics in Central and South America. And investors looking to profit along the Rio Grande turned their attention to railroads and telegraph wires and other forms of communication and transportation, rather than the ships that had funded smuggling or that had facilitated smuggling throughout the 19th century. And as the 19th century wore down, smuggling entered a low point for several decades that persisted until a new conflict reinvigorated illegal trade, and that conflict would be the Mexican Revolution of the 20th century. So I will stop things there. Shay, I guess I'm willing and happy to answer any questions people may have.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was really interesting. A very nice deep dive into some smuggling. So I am going to open it up to our Zoom folks here, and those who are watching on Facebook Live. If you have a question as well, feel free to pop it into the chat feature there, and we will get to it. So does anyone in the Zoom call have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and just shout it out. You just covered it all so well, Kevin.
I know, I just threw a whole lot of information at everybody.
People are really absorbing here. Well, I had a question then. So just briefly, it kind of goes a little bit away from your presentation, but the 1840s runaway communities that you were talking
Mhm.
about, has a lot
Mhm.
of research been done on them and their experiences?
A fair amount, although there's still, I think, a lot more that could be done there. The maroon communities were usually fairly short-lived. Almost none lasted more than a couple of years at a time, as Texas Rangers or the U.S. military would break them up and re-enslave many of the escaped African Americans. They did have the help of the Seminoles, who were running along the Mexico-Texas border and raiding and cattle rustling a lot on both sides. And it was Mexico's policy to welcome runaway slaves as a sort of diplomatic move. Now, some of the ranchers in Texas were constantly upset at these maroon communities. They thought of them as, sort of, bad influences on these slaves in Texas. And it's no secret that many of the cowboys before and after the American Civil War were formerly enslaved African Americans who were part of these maroon communities.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a really interesting story that I don't think really gets told enough.
It really doesn't. There's a lot to be said on that, I think.
Absolutely. So thank you for including it in your presentation. That was really interesting. Um, Anyone else? Questions, comments? Anybody?
It was very interesting. Thank you, Kevin. Learned a lot.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Sydney.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, this is Rena. It's amusing to me, all the talk of basically, all of the smuggling into Mexico, because, I think we often think about history from our 21st, late 20th century perspective. And when we look at kind of the long history, we have the complicated relationship we have with our border. I think it's interesting to note that. But yeah, no, that was really, really fascinating. So thank you for presenting.
Well, thank you. And yeah, it's something that I think really, really deserves a lot more attention, is that both the United States and Mexico, and maybe this is my own American bias since I live in the United States, but the United States and Mexico were both trying to use smuggling as a sort of backhanded tool in their somewhat contentious diplomacy with each other. Mexico was funding some of these maroon communities and raiders into Texas, under the table, of course, and the United States was trying to do much the same thing in the opposite direction.
Yeah, just hearing all about the politics of smuggling, so to speak, was a fascinating addition that I don't think most people usually consider when talking about things like smuggling and piracy and illegal trade. So that was great.
I have a question.
Mm.
When you were talking about the smuggling during the Civil War, the blockades, were some of those blockades the Texas cottonclads?
Yes, and in fact, the blockade of Galveston was the Union blockade of Galveston was broken by some of the Texas cottonclads. It was those that freed up the port of Galveston and allowed it to become such an important blockade running entrepot towards the end of the American Civil War in 1863 and 1864. So the cottonclads were very much involved along the Texas coast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else? This is your last chance. All of your burning smuggling questions. All right. Well, I guess, Kevin, have you at this point tried to smuggle anything to like really get a sense of what it was like? Do you have any tips for anyone?
I think I'll give the little practical experimentation a miss there. There were lots of ways that individuals engaged in smuggling. Of course, this talk was focused on sort of institutional smuggling, large-scale smuggling. But plenty of people were involved in small-scale smuggling of diamonds. Silks was a famous one that happened all the time. Women were thought to be notorious silk smugglers into American ports across the nation, and would wrap themselves in 3 or 4 or 5 layers of silk clothing to try and get past customs officials.
It's some impressive work there. And we do have a question from our Facebook Live crew. Was there much between Texas and Louisiana?
A lot of the smuggling of slaves was going on between Texas and Louisiana. Uh, that was, after all, one of the major destinations for illegal African Americans was the United States proper, or enslaved African Americans was the United States proper. And in fact, some of the last enslaved smuggling voyages were into Louisiana from Texas. So that was where a lot of that trade was occurring. Since, I mean, the traffic in enslaved human beings was so profitable, before Texas was a part of the United States, there was little reason to smuggle anything else when you could just make so much money trafficking enslaved humans.
Awesome. All right.
Another question.
All right.
Okay. You mentioned sometime in the middle of your presentation, the Zona Libre.
Mhm.
Was that the same place as the Nueces Strip?
No. The Nueces Strip was a little further east. The Zona Libre was instituted along the Rio Grande River. They were related, but it was in part of the Nueces Strip that contributed to the Mexican-American War. The Zona Libre was established afterwards.
Okay.
Great. Thank you all so much for your questions. Anyone else? All right. Well, I think that's it. Unless anybody, feel free to interrupt me if you suddenly have a burning question before we sign off. You can also come to Log Cabin Village and visit Kevin, and I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer any other questions you might have. So thank you all again for joining us this evening. Kevin, thank you so much for sharing such interesting information and on such topic we usually don't get to hear too much about. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you all when we reopen after our winter closure. Our closure ends February 15th, so we hope to see you then. And in the meantime, continue to check out all the great things we have going on at the Log Cabin Village and also virtually. We do have a crocheting class coming up in March. So if you'd just really love to learn how to crochet, this is the class for you. And we will also be partnering with the Fort Worth Library next week to give a historic Valentine's program, so you can make your own Valentine historic style. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for one or all of those events, and we will see you all soon. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good night.